He had the boarding pass. He had the first-class seat. He had the quiet confidence of a man who'd earned everything without asking for it. So why did the flight attendant try to remove him? What did she see or not see when she looked at him? And what happens when the man she tried to displace turns out to be one of the people who own the airline? In a world where power is often loud and privilege speaks first, what does it mean when leadership chooses stillness over spectacle? This is not a story about revenge. It's not even a story about a public outburst. It's the story of a black CEO who stayed seated and changed everything, set entirely on a single flight. This journey takes you through tension, silence, accountability, and unexpected transformation, one calm breath at a time. So before we take off, ask yourself, what would I have done in that moment? If you're ready for a story that grips your heart, challenges your thinking, and stays with you long after landing, like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now let's begin. The cabin air was still, not because of turbulence, not because of silence, but because of a moment frozen in tension that made every breath feel rehearsed. Flight 611 from New York to Seattle had just finished boarding. Most passengers were already settled in with earbuds in or seatbelts half-clipped, flipping through safety cards they wouldn't read. Seat 2A, however, had become a stage. Ethan Royce, trim suit, polished leather shoes, and the kind of quiet presence that made people look twice without knowing why, sat motionless. His hands rested on the armrests of the first-class seat he had paid for, same as always, not out of indulgence, but necessity. He didn't speak at first when the flight attendant stood over him. She was in her mid-40s, hair pulled into a neat French twist. Her smile had faded 2 minutes ago. "I'm going to need you to move to economy." "Sir," she repeated, her tone clipped yet professional, like a blade dulled just enough to be considered polite. Ethan's voice, when it came, was calm, deep, deliberate. "I'm sorry. There must be a mistake." Her name tag read Olivia Grant, a name that would soon be repeated in offices, phone calls, headlines, and memories. "There's been an update in our system," Olivia said. "Your seat has been changed. We need to make room in this section." Ethan looked down at the boarding pass he'd held from the start. "Uwe, first class, Pacific Air Flight 611. I haven't changed anything in my booking," he said, without raising his voice. "I checked in 2 hours ago. The seat was assigned. There was no error." "Yes. Well," Olivia replied, folding her hands tightly over her tablet. "The system reflects otherwise now. If you'd like to speak with customer service after we land." I'm sure Ethan held up a hand. Not high, not abrupt, just enough to pause her speech mid-sentence. Passengers in 2B and 3A were watching now. Subtle, but definite. "I'd prefer," Ethan said slowly, "to resolve this before we take off." He reached into his coat pocket. Olivia instinctively tensed. He noticed, but said nothing. What he pulled out wasn't a wallet or a badge or a corporate ID. It was a simple leather-bound phone. He unlocked it with one thumb swipe, opened a folder marked Royce Legal, and tapped a contact. Her voice stiffened. "Sir, I don't think this is necessary." He spoke over the ringtone, eyes still on her. "Miss Grant, may I have your full name and employee ID, please?" She blinked. "Excuse me." "For the record," he said, "and to ensure your protocol is accurately documented." Her professional smile began to tremble. "I'm following airline guidelines. I'm following federal business documentation practices." Ethan replied. The phone connected. "Hello," he said. "Now calm as ever. This is Ethan Royce. I'm on Pacific Air Flight 611 to Seattle." We have a developing personnel matter I'd like to officially log. Silence. All around them. The air inside the cabin seemed to lower by a few degrees. Everyone within earshot, dozens of them, froze mid-shuffle. Even the captain's voice fell silent over the intercom. Olivia's voice cracked. "Sir," again. "I'd appreciate it if you could just move. I will not be moving to seat 22, Ethan said plainly. Nor will I be tolerating an unsubstantiated reassignment in the absence of airline verification. If your system made an error, I suggest it's corrected, not enforced on paying customers." He paused, especially not selectively enforced. Behind the curtain, a few flight attendants murmured. A junior attendant, barely 22, peeked around and caught Olivia's eye. The look she gave her supervisor said it all. "He's not bluffing." Olivia straightened her posture. "You can't just call someone, and I didn't call someone," Ethan said. He ended the call and placed the phone neatly on the tray table. "I called my acquisition counsel. As of this morning, Royce Technologies has completed its strategic merger with Pacific Air Group. That seat," he nodded calmly toward Tuo, "was part of a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. And I suggest, Miss Grant, that you take that very seriously." Passengers in first class were no longer pretending not to listen. The man in 2B put down his newspaper. A woman across the aisle adjusted her glasses, staring without blinking. Olivia opened her mouth, closed it again, and said nothing. Instead, she turned and walked toward the cockpit, stiff, unsteady, like she had just walked into a fog too thick to pretend wasn't there. Ethan exhaled quietly, the smallest of movements, controlled, but inside, his heart pounded, not with fear, but with something deeper, older. How many rooms, how many board meetings, how many lounges and lobbies and airports have asked me silently or known if I belonged? How many times did I comply just to stay unseen? Not this time. 6 minutes had passed. 6 minutes since she told him to move. 6 minutes since the cabin turned into a courtroom. 6 minutes since the past 2 decades of professionalism and control rose to meet the moment. And now footsteps returned. It wasn't Olivia. It was the captain. And behind him 2 crew members, one holding a clipboard, one holding Olivia's satchel. The change had begun, and for Ethan Royce, the seat he refused to leave had just become something more than legroom and early boarding. It had become a symbol. The alarm rang at 4:50 sharp, though Ethan Royce was already awake. He lay there in the quiet darkness of his upper-floor Manhattan apartment, staring at the ceiling as the soft amber glow from the smart blinds began to mimic sunrise. He never trusted alarms. Sleep, for him, was shallow on the nights before big days. And today wasn't just any day. It was the day he became majority owner of Pacific Air Group through Royce Technologies' most ambitious acquisition to date, one that would expand his firm's infrastructure footprint across 5 global markets. A silent empire, built through code, culture, and control. In the kitchen, the espresso machine hummed to life. Ethan moved with quiet precision, dress shirt already pressed and hung on the back of a chair the night before. Dark charcoal suit folded neatly. Watch resting on a velvet tray. He checked the news feed on his tablet while sipping black coffee. Market buzz was already circulating. Royce poised to take Pacific Air private industry whispers swirl. He allowed himself one dry smile. Whispers. They'd hear the full roar by noon, Pacific time. From the bedroom doorway, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You're overthinking again." Serena stood there, her hair in a satin wrap. robe knotted loosely at the waist, watching him with the same amused exasperation she'd carried since their early days in grad school. Ethan looked up. "Just running through the talking points. You've been rehearsing the same strategy for 5 months. They'll approve it in 15 minutes. I know." He paused. "It's not the boardroom I'm worried about." Serena walked closer, placed a hand on his wrist. "The flight." He nodded. "I just want it to be uneventful." Serena tilted her head. "People like you don't get uneventful flights." "Ethan." She meant it gently, but the truth hung in the air between them. "People like you, black, composed, successful beyond the assumptions others project the second they see you." Ethan had been stopped at security gates while in tailored suits, questioned about conference badges with his name on them, escorted out of first-class lounges only to return moments later with an executive's direct apology. He always accepted the apology, but it didn't erase the look before it. "I'll be fine," he said. "You always are," Serena replied. "But maybe today. Don't just be fine." He raised an eyebrow. "What's that mean?" "It means," she said, straightening his tie and brushing invisible lint from his lapel, "you don't have to carry it all in silence today." Ethan exhaled. "What if I end up making the wrong kind of noise?" Serena smiled. "Then let it be the kind they finally hear." By 6:15, Ethan was in the back seat of a Lincoln Town car, gliding through early Manhattan traffic toward LaGuardia. His driver, Jorge, had worked with him for years and knew better than to make small talk on mornings like this. The sky was streaked with pinks and slate blue as the skyline began to melt into the horizon behind them. Ethan scrolled through his phone. Calendar, flight, investor notes, talking points. He reread the final version of the Seattle presentation. It was good lean, precise, undeniable, just like he liked it. This is the culmination of everything, he thought. And still, something tightens in me before every flight. Inside the terminal, Ethan moved efficiently. He didn't check bags, never had. His carry-on was precisely packed, down to the charger coils and pressed documents in a leather folder. TSA, pre-check, clear, fast track to the gate. He passed casually by groups of men in fleece vests and Patagonia duffels, consultants talking into AirPods, their words littered with acronyms and urgency. No one noticed him, until they did. Always the same beat glance, glance again, silent calibration. Is he someone? Is he where he's supposed to be? At the Pacific Air Sky Lounge. A young attendant smiled brightly. "Mr. Royce, welcome back. Would you like anything before boarding?" He nodded. "Just water. Thank you." On his way to the gate, he passed a security agent with an overeager look who took one long scan of Ethan's boarding pass longer than was necessary. The agent didn't say anything. Ethan didn't ask why. He just walked on, like he always did. Gate B17 was already boarding when Ethan arrived. He was early enough to skip the line. As he handed the gate agent his phone, she smiled faintly but said nothing. The scanner beeped green. Seat 2A, first class. Ethan walked through the jet bridge, greeted the flight attendant at the cabin door, and found his seat quickly. He placed his briefcase beneath the seat, his coat over his lap, put on his noise-canceling earbuds, though no music played. He stared out the window, watching the tarmac bustle. Please let this flight just go? He didn't expect fanfare. He never did. He only wanted to arrive on time, intact and unseen. He didn't know that in less than an hour, the seat beneath him would become the front line of a public storm. But even now, Before the seatbelt light clicked on, Ethan sensed it. A shift in the energy. A new flight attendant walking up the aisle. One he hadn't seen at the door. Her voice would come next. Polite, tense, directed straight at him. "Sir, I'm going to need to verify your seat." The air inside the cabin had that recycled chill Ethan always noticed. It never bothered him. He found it oddly centering, clinical, neutral, impersonal, like a theater before the curtain rose. He slid into seat 2A, rested his briefcase beneath his feet, and looked out the window. The tarmac buzzed with glowing vests, reflective lights, the occasional crackle of wheels dragging carts toward the fuselage. He loved this part, the moment between departure and flight. No noise, no demands, just time and suspension. But then came the voice. "Excuse me, sir." At first, he thought it wasn't directed at him. He looked slightly to the side, maybe someone behind, but when he glanced up, she was already staring at him. The woman had just replaced the younger flight attendant who had originally welcomed him aboard. This one had a tighter posture and a colder edge behind the courtesy. Olivia Grant. New shift. Different tone. Ethan removed one earbud. "Yes." She smiled thinly. "I'm going to need to verify your seat assignment. Please." He blinked once, but didn't react. Then calmly reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out his phone. Tapped the lock screen. Displayed the boarding pass. 2A. First class, he said, his voice clear but neutral. She looked at it, then looked at him, then back at the screen again, as if she expected the pixels to rearrange themselves. "Thank you," she said, but didn't move. "I'll just need to recheck this with the manifest." Ethan hesitated. Was there a change, he asked? Not exactly. There was a sync issue. Happens sometimes. Just protocol. She walked away, taking mental notes of the seat and his name. Ethan watched her go, and felt it. The quiet beginning of a familiar friction. Not overt, not violent, but that low-grade hum of suspicion. He'd seen it before. A glance that lasted a second too long. A question delivered a shade too flat. A routine check that only seemed to apply to him. He turned to the window again, tried to breathe through it, tried not to assume. But even trying not to assume was, itself, a form of labor. Behind him, he could hear laughter from rows 4 and 5-some consultants in fleece vests talking about performance reviews and skiing. A flight attendant passed them and smiled. No questions, no scans, no manifest checks. Ethan's jaw flexed just once. Don't get ahead of yourself. Royce. Maybe it's nothing. But he knew better. It was never nothing. A few minutes later, Olivia returned, now holding a tablet. "Mr. Royce, I appreciate your patience," she began. Her tone was still composed, but more rehearsed now, as if she were already explaining herself to someone else in her mind. "I'm afraid your seat has been reassigned due to a system reallocation. You've been moved to 22C in the economy cabin." Ethan stared at her, not in disbelief, just long enough for her to feel the weight of silence. "Then," he replied softly, "on what grounds?" "There was a duplicate scan," she said quickly. "Another passenger is showing up as assigned to this seat. We're still investigating, but to stay on schedule, I need you to temporarily relocate. To economy. Yes. After I boarded first class, with a verified pass, no prior notification, and now I'm being told to move because of a system duplication that hasn't been resolved. Yes." Ethan inhaled deeply. His hands rested on the armrests, perfectly still. "Who's been assigned this seat? I'm afraid I can't disclose that." Sir, who issued the reassignment system-wide reallocation? Was anyone else reassigned? A pause. Too long. No, sir. There it was. The answer that told the truth. She wasn't just following a glitch. She was executing an assumption. Ethan could feel heat blooming beneath his collar, but he didn't let it surface. He kept his voice even. You're asking me to comply with a seat reassignment based on unverifiable data, impacting only me, with no notification, no compensation, no inquiry, and you're offering no explanation beyond system error. She shifted her stance. I'm simply asking you to cooperate so the flight can continue on time. Of course you are, Ethan thought. Cooperate. Quiet down. Make it easier for everyone else. He sat there, unmoving. Passengers were watching again, some discreetly, some not. A man across the aisle, white, in his 50s, gave Olivia a subtle nod of encouragement. Ethan saw it. So did she. Reinforcement. Silent permission. This was how it happened. Polite pressure, social momentum, the smiling choreography of dismissal. But today, he wasn't playing along. He reached for his phone, unlocked it, tapped a name he never called unless necessary. He'd hoped never to use it in a setting like this. But this wasn't just about comfort now. It was about principle. As the phone rang, Olivia's mouth opened. He raised a hand, not rudely, just firmly. No need to repeat your explanation. He said, This won't take long. As she watched him, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, not yet, but recognition. That this moment, it wasn't going the way it usually did. And Ethan, he wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't making a scene. But the air had shifted, and she wasn't in control anymore. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Royce Technologies Executive Office. This is Camille. Ethan didn't take his eyes off Olivia Grant. His voice remained calm, measured. Camille, please document a personnel incident occurring on Pacific Air Flight 611 First Class Cabin. A service-level reassignment has been issued without basis, and a formal protocol violation may have occurred. There was a pause on the line. Camille had worked with Ethan long enough to know if he was calling mid-flight boarding. Something was wrong. Understood, she replied quickly. Do you want me to notify legal? Not yet. Just log the time, seat number, and names if available. I'll send further details after departure. He ended the call, set the phone gently back on the tray table, then turned to Olivia, and simply said, Now, would you like to explain what exactly happened to my seat? The tension in the cabin was no longer subtle. Rows 1 through 3 were leaning in just enough to hear. The man in 2B was now openly watching, lips parted slightly, unsure whether to support Olivia or pretend to read his tablet. Olivia's cheeks flushed slightly, though she kept her voice even. I told you, Mr. Royce, there was a synchronization issue in our system. These things happen, especially during multi-segment international reroutes I'm flying from New York to Seattle, Ethan said flatly. This is a non-stop domestic route. Well, yes, she stammered, but there's still a chance the system read you as what? The silence after that question landed like glass breaking inside the cabin. Ethan didn't blink. Olivia opened her mouth again, but no words came, because she knew what he meant, and so did everyone within earshot. It wasn't about a system glitch. It wasn't about protocols. It was about something more familiar. That unconscious itch, that unspoken logic. He doesn't look like he belongs here. Maybe he got bumped up. Maybe he's in the wrong cabin. Maybe someone more appropriate was meant to sit there. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering just enough to signal weight. I've worked too hard for too long to let small rewrites of reality go unchecked. I'm not moving seats. Olivia folded her arms across her tablet. I'm simply doing my job. Sir. No, he said. You're doing something else entirely. And we both know it. Her lips tightened. And then, just like that, she played her card. I'm going to ask you to cooperate, she said. If you do not comply, I may need to involve security. That did it. A sharp breath stirred among the nearby passengers. Even the man in 2B looked away. Security. That word wasn't neutral. Not when aimed at a black man. Not in a public place. Not when the accusation wasn't what he did, but how long he stayed seated. Ethan swallowed the bitter heat rising in his throat. He'd done this dance before. Once at a tech conference in San Diego, where a hotel manager insisted he was in the wrong ballroom. Another time in Zurich, when an investor mistook him for a driver. He always kept his cool. Always. But this moment was different. This wasn't some private misread. This was public erasure, unfolding in slow motion, in front of others, in front of silence. And still, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't snap. He didn't accuse. He simply reached into the side pocket of his briefcase, pulled out a folded envelope, and set it gently on his tray. It was marked Confidential, Pacific Air Group Board Shareholder Summary. Perhaps this will help you understand, he said, unfolding the first page. It listed his name, Ethan Royce, founding CEO, Royce Technologies voting stakeholder, 33.4% Pacific Air Group acquisition approval. Filed 5, 41 a.m. EST today. He handed it to Olivia. She didn't take it. Instead, she blinked once, twice, and took a half step back. Ethan sat tall in 2A, his voice quiet, nearly a whisper. I don't need your seat. Miss Grant, I already own part of this airline. I just need you to stop deciding, for reasons you won't say aloud, that I don't belong in it. The nearby flight attendant, one of Olivia's juniors, stepped forward. She looked no older than 23, hair braided tightly beneath her cap, voice wavering but resolute. Would you like me to assist Mr. Royce from here? Ma'am, she asked. The kindness in her voice was unmistakable, but so was the indictment. A quiet call-out of what had been done. Olivia's lips parted, then closed again. She turned and walked briskly toward the front galley. The new attendant, her name tag reading Marla, knelt beside Ethan. I'm sorry, sir, she said gently. She shouldn't have handled it that way. Ethan looked at her, saw the honesty in her eyes, then exhaled, slowly. Thank you. Marla, he said, that will be all. He returned to his seat. He didn't look up for a while, didn't glance to his left or right. He just sat there, still, breathing inside his chest. Something cracked, not from pain, but release. Not everything had to be carried in silence. And this time, he chose to stay seated. Ethan Royce sat in silence. The quiet in seat 2A was different now. Not the quiet of being unseen, not the quiet of shrinking, but the quiet of intention. The hum of the aircraft system vibrated through the floor beneath his shoes. The boarding door hadn't closed yet, but the pressure in the cabin had already shifted. Passengers were whispering. The envelope lay on his tray table, still open, the ink still drying from a last-minute boardroom printer only hours earlier. The document said what Olivia Grant hadn't been ready to hear he belonged. And not because of status, not because of favor, but because he built something that could buy the very sky she worked in. He stared at the blank screen of his phone for a few seconds, then dialed a different number. This one wasn't for documentation. It was for resolution. It rang once, twice. A calm, clipped British accent answered. Richard Langston. Ethan didn't waste time. We've got a personnel issue on Flight 611. One of your crew members, Olivia Grant, has escalated a seat conflict rooted in what I'd call presumptive profiling. There was a pause. Langston replied softly. Understood. Do you want it handled quietly or formally? Ethan's lips tightened. The weight of that question always stung. How many times had he been offered quiet correction instead of loud accountability? This time, he took a breath before answering. Documented, transparent, real time. Langston's voice was calm but respectful now. I'll notify Ground Command and Regional HR. You'll be supported. Anything else? Ethan shook his head, though Langston couldn't see it. Not yet. They hung up. As the line disconnected, Ethan felt it. The turning point. The decision he'd made to press, to hold the line, wasn't just about this flight anymore. It was about decades of erasure that had been politely tolerated in the name of peace. And something in him had shifted. 10 minutes passed. The boarding door still hadn't shut. Ethan noticed Marla, the younger attendant, walking swiftly down the aisle. She stopped by Olivia at the front galley. He couldn't hear what was said, but he could see the stiffness in Olivia's shoulders, the way her arms crossed tighter than necessary. Behind them, a man in a navy vest and a headset entered the plane. He looked out of place. Not a gate agent, not a flight crew member. He walked directly to 2A and crouched slightly. Mr. Royce, the man asked quietly. Ethan nodded. I'm Alan Mendoza, Director of Onboard Services. I'm here on behalf of Ground Command. The man lowered his voice, but his posture radiated urgency. We received a directive from Mr. Langston. We're currently reviewing internal video and communication logs. In the meantime, we're relocating Ms. Grant from her current assignment and replacing her with alternate cabin staff. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Permanently, Alan hesitated, pending full review and disciplinary panel, for no immediate removal from Flight 611. Ethan gave a small nod. Understood. He didn't ask for fanfare, didn't want it to be dramatic. He only wanted it to be honest. Alan stood and turned. A second later, Olivia was summoned by name. Passengers watched as she walked, shoulders back, lips drawn tight, eyes staring ahead down the aisle toward the boarding door. No yelling, no confrontation, just consequences. Ethan didn't gloat. He didn't lean back in satisfaction. He just closed the file folder in front of him, tucked it back into his briefcase, and exhaled. He looked out the window. The fuel truck rolled past. The crew gave the thumbs up. A slight jolt indicated door closure. They were about to leave. But his mind stayed here. It drifted, not to the power the call he made, but to every call he didn't. The ones where he let things go. Swallowed indignity. Smiled through bias. All the polite dismissals. All the coded language. All the times he was asked for ID when others weren't. All the times he was assumed to be the driver, or the assistant, or security. He had thought that success would insulate him from those moments. But it hadn't. And maybe it never would. Ethan pressed his head lightly against the seat back and closed his eyes. He felt the tremble knot in his hands, but in his gut. Not anger, not fear. Grief. Grief for how long he'd accepted this as a condition of movement. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Royce. It was Marla again. She now stood where Olivia had once stood. but her presence felt entirely different. Gentle, unafraid. We're all set. Would you like anything before takeoff? Coffee, tea? Ethan opened his eyes. Thought for a second, then smiled faintly. Still just water. Thank you. Marla smiled back. Coming right up. As she turned, Ethan glanced across the aisle. The man in 2B was watching him, not unkindly, but with an expression Ethan had seen before. Guilt. The man spoke, awkwardly. Sir, I hope that situation didn't spoil your morning. Ethan offered a small nod. It clarified it. And that was all he said. Outside, the plane began to taxi. Inside, the cabin shifted from discomfort to curiosity. Everyone had witnessed something, and though no one spoke it aloud, they all knew exactly what had happened, and this time no one could look away. The plane lifted from the runway with a smooth hum. For a few moments, all that filled the cabin was the low drone of ascent and the quiet shuffle of passengers adjusting tray tables or closing their eyes. Ethan Royce didn't move. He watched the New York skyline shrink below the clouds, the buildings disappearing beneath a blanket of haze. It was peaceful now, but his thoughts were still pulsing. Not with rage, not even with relief, but with a strange kind of sadness that crept in after the moment passed. A sadness not for himself, but for how many others had sat in this same seat, in this same kind of moment, and chosen to stay silent. Marla returned with his water, setting it down gently. Anything else I can get you, Mr. Royce? He looked up at her. No, thank you. She hesitated a moment, then said softly, That was incredibly composed. I've seen passengers lose it over peanuts. And you, I've had practice, Ethan replied. He gave a tired smile. Not bitter, just lived in. A few seats back, someone coughed. A whisper followed, then another. Ethan noticed the older gentleman in 2B was still glancing sideways, curious, hesitant. Finally, the man leaned closer. I don't mean to pry, he said, his voice low, but are you someone important? Ethan turned slightly, resting his elbow on the armrest. Depends who you ask. The man chuckled nervously. Fair enough. Just what you said earlier about the airline. Are you really part of the ownership group? Ethan nodded once. Yes. Royce Technologies finalized an acquisition of Pacific Air this morning. The man blinked. Wait, Royce. As in the software firm, Ethan simply replied, Yes. And just like that, everything changed. The man leaned back slowly, processing, and as if on cue, the whisper network spread. A passenger in 3A opened his phone and began typing something into a search bar. Another in 1D turned slightly to glance toward Ethan, eyes widening just a bit. Within minutes, the quiet recognition began to roll across the cabin like a tide. People didn't speak, but their posture changed. Their energy shifted. The man in 2B finally spoke again. I'm Harold. I run logistics for a shipping group in Jersey. We use Royceware for scheduling. Ethan smiled faintly. I appreciate your business. And there it was. Confirmation. Ethan Royce wasn't just a businessman. He was the businessman. A tech architect who had built one of the most resilient data management ecosystems in the country. A man whose software quietly ran the back end of airports, hospitals, and entire government operations. The kind of presence that usually entered through private lounges and shareholder decks. Not through aisle 2A. Quietly. Alone. Marla returned with another round of drinks for the cabin. Her face was calm, but there was a glow of quiet respect in her eyes now. Not fear, not pity, but recognition. When she leaned down to place a napkin on Ethan's tray, she whispered, "I told my supervisor once that the way we treat people, especially in first class, says more about us than them." Ethan looked up. "You were right." Marla smiled. "I was told I cared too much." He paused. "That's not a weakness." She stood upright. "I'll remind myself of that." Back across the aisle, the man in 2B Harrell was still deep in thought. After a few beats of silence, he said, "I just want to say I didn't speak up earlier. I saw what was happening, and I stayed quiet. And I'm sorry." Ethan didn't respond right away. He let the apology sit in the air for a second, then turned his head, looked the man in the eyes, and said, "You don't have to apologize for watching. But maybe ask yourself what you were waiting to see before you decided it was worth saying something." Harold nodded. "No excuses. Just listening." That was the thing about being underestimated. It came with a kind of superpower if you knew how to wield it. Ethan didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to make a spectacle. He let the silence carry the weight of what had been done and what had been undone. A notification buzzed on his phone. Camille, from his office, had sent a brief update incident logged. "Olivia Grant will be processed through disciplinary review. Langston confirmed public communication will remain internal for now unless you direct otherwise." Ethan tapped out a reply. "No press. Not about punishment. But let's start drafting a new training protocol. Empathy should be a required skill, not a bonus one." He set the phone down, exhaled again. Outside, clouds rolled by like memory. He leaned back, not as a man who had won, not as a man who had punished anyone, but as a man who had simply held his ground. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to apologize for doing so. Ethan Royce leaned into the silence, 35,000 feet above the ground. Yet it was the internal noise that rose louder than anything mechanical. Not turbulence, not engines, just thoughts. The kind that stirred after the adrenaline faded. The kind that whispered, was it enough? Was it too much? He stared out the window as the clouds pulled apart like silk. Far below, the Rockies stretched like folded paper, indifferent to the conversations unfolding inside the aircraft. A thin chime echoed through the cabin as the captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've now reached cruising altitude. Flight time to Seattle is approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes. The words faded into static. Marla returned with a warm towel and a question. "Would you prefer breakfast now? Or a bit later?" Ethan shook his head lightly. "Later's fine." "Thank you." She hesitated, then quietly added, "The crew, they're talking about it. Everyone is—" Ethan met her eyes. "About Olivia," Marla nodded. "And about you. About what it means." He didn't reply right away. Just nodded once. Then let her go. It was strange. This feeling. The clarity he had in moments of tension. It always gave way to a kind of emotional fog afterward. He had done the right thing. He knew that. And yet, some small voice inside still asked, did I break something that could have been fixed quietly? Did I cause her career to implode? But then would she have stopped if I hadn't resisted? If I'd moved to economy? Taken the hit in silence? Would she have reflected at all? Probably not. His phone buzzed gently. A new message. Langston. From Pacific Air Corporate. We've reviewed the initial crew audio logs and security footage. Your version aligns with what we're seeing. Then another follow-up. Would you like to submit a formal termination request for Miss Grant before she reaches internal review? Ethan read the message twice. His thumb hovered over the screen, not out of uncertainty, but something deeper, responsibility. He didn't need vengeance. What he needed, what he wanted, was change. So instead of replying with yes or terminate, he opened a blank message and typed slowly, "She should face accountability. But I want her sent to empathy-based retraining first. Make that mandatory for all leads, especially in first class." He paused, then added, "Reinstate her only if she shows understanding. This isn't about punishment. It's about whether she's teachable." He hit send. It was a decision born not of anger, but of clarity. You could fire a person in 6 minutes, but changing the system that created her assumptions, that required more patience, more pressure, more intention. A chime again. This time it was the in-flight service cart rolling up the aisle. Harold, in 2B, leaned over slightly. His voice was quiet, but genuine. "You didn't ask for any of this." "Huh?" Ethan glanced at him. "Depends what you mean." Harold cleared his throat. "I mean the reaction, the power, the attention. Feels like you just wanted to fly in peace." Ethan allowed himself a dry smile. That's always the dream. They sat in silence for a few seconds. Then Harold added, "I'm sorry again, not just for staying quiet, but for how many times people like me don't even notice." Ethan appreciated the honesty, but he didn't want pity. So he turned and said, "Awareness matters, but it's only the first step. The next one is action, especially when it's uncomfortable." Harold nodded slowly. "Noted." Back in the front galley, the cabin manager approached Marla discreetly. "I heard Mr. Royce declined termination." Marla blinked. "He asked for training instead." "Yes. Says he wants her to understand, not just disappear." Marla looked down the aisle at Ethan, and something inside her shifted. Not admiration, though that was there, but permission. Permission to believe that calm didn't mean weakness, that grace could live beside accountability, and that change could come, even quietly. Meanwhile, at Pacific Air headquarters in Seattle, Richard Langston forwarded Ethan's training directive to the internal culture team. Subject line urgent. Executive action on Flight 611. His message was brief. In response to Mr. Royce's experience, we are implementing an immediate review of all bias prevention and leadership empathy training modules. Prepare rollout plan for exec sign-off within 48 hours. He paused before hitting send, then added Ethan Royce. Just gave us a chance to fix the air we fly in. Let's not waste it. Back in the sky, Ethan finally accepted a breakfast tray, just fruit and black tea. He wasn't hungry, but he needed the ritual of normalcy, the return to routine. He opened a notebook from his briefcase, one he always carried on flights, not for business, but for thoughts he didn't want in the cloud. He wrote, "The power isn't in the seat. It's in the silence we choose not to keep anymore." He stared at the sentence, then underlined it twice. Outside, the sun began climbing higher. Clouds thinned. The cabin light softened. Ethan sat still, pen in hand, heart steady now. Not because it was over, but because something had begun. Harold Metz didn't sleep on planes. Never had. But this flight, this one felt different. He sat in 2B, arms folded, coffee growing cold on his tray. His gaze flicking now and then toward the window, where Ethan Royce sat still and composed quiet, as always. Eyes focused on something deeper than the clouds outside. Harold had traveled his whole life. Boardrooms in Boston, shipping docks in Tampa, fleets to manage, people to coach, numbers to track. He had seen 100 faces like Ethan's, polished, sharp, understated, but never once had he paused to ask what that kind of composure cost. Until today, when it first happened, when the flight attendant asked Ethan for his seat. Harold had watched with the same quiet detachment he'd honed over years of executive etiquette. Don't get involved. Let the staff handle it. Stay in your lane. That's what professionalism meant, right? Except now, it didn't feel like professionalism. It felt like cowardice. Harold sipped the lukewarm coffee and grimaced. Across the aisle, Ethan was scribbling something in a notebook. Still calm, still dignified, but something about him made Harold's chest tighten. He recognized it now. Not just confidence, restraint. And for the first time in a long time, Harold felt ashamed of how quiet he had been. He remembered the moment Olivia had said the word security, and how, even then, he didn't speak. He remembered looking down at his tablet, pretending to read a report, all while knowing he stood up. It might change the tone of the moment. If he said, "He's fine. Let him sit." Maybe it would have softened the edge. But he didn't. He waited. Why? Because part of him had been trained, like most men of his generation, to let institutions play out their rules, to trust the chain of command. But today showed him something raw. Sometimes the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. And people like him, they benefited from the silence of others. He turned to Ethan slowly, voice low. "Do you think I should have said something?" Ethan looked up from his notebook. Calm eyes, steady expression. "I think you just did." Harold gave a dry laugh. "I mean earlier, when it was happening." Ethan paused, then replied, "I think you had a choice, and now you have another one." Harold nodded. It wasn't judgmental, but it was true. He leaned back and stared at the seat in front of him. Memories started surfacing, not just today, but years of meetings, handshakes, casual jokes that made him uncomfortable, but not enough to object. Moments where he had the power to speak up, but didn't. Moments where he was the one being centered, and others were asked to shrink. He tapped his phone open, scrolled to his work email. For a moment, his thumb hovered over a drafted memo, something he'd been meaning to send to his team new logistics KPIs, a dull procedural note. But now he backed out of that draft, opened a new one. Subject line: a change in our leadership culture. He began typing. Today, on Pacific Air Flight 611, I witnessed something that made me question my own behavior as a leader. Not because someone yelled, but because someone didn't. And in that silence, I realized how often I have been silent, too. He kept writing. Slow, raw, real. Across the aisle, Ethan kept writing in his own notebook. Harold looked up. Their eyes met again. And for the first time, Ethan gave him something unexpected, a small, real smile. In that moment, Harold realized something. Change didn't always start with grand gestures. Sometimes it started with a quiet seatmate, a moment of discomfort, a mirror held up to your own hesitation. He looked out the window again. The clouds looked the same, but he didn't. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight glided deeper into the sky. By now, the passengers in first class were no longer pretending they weren't part of something larger. The air had changed, not in temperature, but in tone. Conversations that might have remained superficial shifted into something else, more personal, more reflective, more real. Ethan Royce had closed his notebook. He wasn't tired, but his thoughts were beginning to settle like dust after a quiet collapse. No more adrenaline, no more tactical thinking, just quiet breath and a strange stillness. But then, from row 3, a woman leaned forward. She was in her mid-40s, silver streak in her hair, dressed in a fitted navy blazer and slacks. Her voice was calm. "Mr. Royce Ethan turned slightly. "Yes, I just wanted to say thank you." He blinked. For what? For not letting it slide. She stood in the aisle briefly, a little awkward, as if unsure whether to approach or retreat. "I've flown this airline for 17 years, she said, "and I've seen things, little things, quiet things, but I always told myself it wasn't my place to get involved." Ethan nodded. "I understand," she added, "but watching you stay seated without raising your voice, without causing a scene, was one of the strongest things I've ever seen on a plane." He offered a small, tired smile. "I wasn't trying to be strong. I was just tired of getting up when I shouldn't have to." Her eyes flickered. "That makes sense." The woman returned to her seat, but her words stayed behind unspoken echoes that gave others permission to step forward. A young Asian man in 1D adjusted his seat and spoke next. "I'm Daniel," he said. "Work in AI compliance." Ethan gave a polite nod. "Nice to meet you." "I know this isn't a TED Talk," Daniel said with a nervous laugh, "but I just wanted to say, it's easy to underestimate how many of us carry those stories around. Not the same ones, but the same feeling." Ethan tilted his head. "Which feeling? The quiet erosion, the moment someone implies, without saying, that you're lucky just to be here." Ethan's eyes held his, and in a low, soft voice, he replied, "I've spent decades proving I belong in rooms that were designed to exclude me. But sometimes the harder thing is choosing not to prove anything and just staying seated." Daniel nodded slowly. "That hits." Harold and 2B stayed quiet through all of this, but listened. So did Marla, the new flight attendant, standing further up the aisle, pretending to check the galley cart, but her eyes were soft, present, like she was learning, too. A woman in 1A, maybe 60, with pearls and a voice that sounded like Sunday school, chimed in from behind a magazine. I once told a black coworker he was so well-spoken. Thought I was giving a compliment. She closed the magazine, and now I think about that comment at least once a week. The cabin chuckled softly, not mockingly, but knowingly. Ethan turned to her and said gently, "Yes, it's not the mistake that defines you. It's what you learn after it." She smiled, a little misty-eyed. "Thank you for that." By now, the cabin had taken on an unusual feel. It wasn't just a row of seats anymore. It was a space for something else. Something unintended but healing. The truth is, none of these people had planned to learn anything today. They were executives, consultants, senior partners, and analysts. They boarded the plane expecting black coffee, fast Wi-Fi, and 4 hours of uninterrupted work. Instead, they had received a mirror, held up calmly, without accusation, but undeniably. And Ethan, he hadn't expected this either. He was never one for public conversations, never the guy giving interviews or keynote speeches. His genius was in systems, structure, strategy. But maybe this moment was part of his architecture, a different kind of code, one that rewired behavior instead of data. He reached down and took another sip of water. His throat felt dry, not from speaking too much, but from the weight of being heard, a rare thing, and a heavier one than most realized. From the far end of first class, someone clapped, not loud, just once, and someone else joined in. Ethan's eyes widened for a second until he realized what it was. Not applause, appreciation, Not for drama, not for performance, but for integrity. The moment passed quickly. The plane continued its smooth course through the sky, and the conversation faded back to soft murmurs, rustling papers, and casual nods. But something had shifted in everyone aboard. Even if nothing was said again, the next time they witnessed a moment like this, they wouldn't stay seated in silence. The seatbelt sign chimed on. A quiet ripple passed through the cabin as passengers sat up, unplugged laptops, stretched sore limbs, and prepared to return to the ground. Seattle's skyline glimmered below glass and water stitched together beneath gray morning haze. But Ethan Royce wasn't watching the skyline. He was watching his own reflection in the small oval window, blurred slightly by condensation, blurred further by thought. The adrenaline had long worn off, and what was left behind wasn't relief. It was weight, not regret, not guilt, just the ache that came with having to stand up in a space where you never should have been forced to. People often assumed power felt good, that owning part of a company, or sitting on a board, or leading a software empire meant you walked into every room with ease. But Ethan knew better. Real power, when you looked like him, meant carrying every micro-decision with precision. Every tone, every word, every raised eyebrow that didn't rise back. Because a single crack in your calm could confirm someone else's narrative. He sighed quietly. His throat was dry, his chest heavy. And he hated that moments like this still followed him. Even now. Even here. He glanced down the aisle. The first-class cabin had grown quiet again. But this silence was different. Not ignorance, not discomfort. It was earned. Earned by the way people had listened and stayed with the discomfort instead of retreating from it. Harold in 2B was rereading something on his phone, perhaps the email he'd drafted earlier. Across the aisle, Daniel had fallen asleep with his hoodie pulled over his head. The woman in 1A, the one who admitted to her mistake, gave Ethan a small nod as she folded her blanket. He returned it soft. Sincere. It wasn't a thank you. It was something deeper. A quiet pact. Marla passed through the cabin one last time, collecting used napkins and untouched fruit plates. When she reached Ethan, she paused, hands behind her back. I just want to say, she said gently, you changed how I think about my role today. He raised an eyebrow slightly. How so? She glanced around, then said, I used to think calm passengers made my job easier. But now I realize it's the ones who stay calm when they shouldn't have to that are carrying the most. Ethan blinked. That landed harder than she probably knew. He nodded. That's exactly it. Marla smiled. I hope I never forget this flight. Then added, I hope the next Olivia doesn't either. As she moved on, Ethan reached for his notebook again. He flipped to a new page and wrote, There is a cost to grace, a tax for every time we keep still when injustice knocks. But sometimes grace isn't about sparing others. It's about preserving ourselves. He stared at the words, then closed the book. The plane began its descent. Tray tables locked, windows opened. A hum of activity resumed as if nothing had happened. But for Ethan, this landing felt different, because some landings weren't just about geography. Some were about where your truth had finally landed. He reached for his phone. Another message from Camille. His executive assistant media picked up unverified reports of an incident on Flight 611. Do you want to respond? He paused, then typed, No interviews, no statements. This wasn't about press. It was about presence. Then added, But make sure every executive at Pacific Air knows sympathy isn't optional. We lead from the cabin, not just the boardroom. His phone buzzed again. This time a new message from Langston. We've begun drafting the empathy training rollout. You'll have first review by Friday. Also internal team requests to rename it the Royce Protocol. Ethan frowned. He didn't want his name on it. He didn't want a plaque or press release. He just wanted people like Marla to be the norm, not the exception. Still, he replied, call it whatever you need. Just make sure it works. The wheels hit the tarmac. A soft bounce, then a long, quiet deceleration. And with it, the final release of tension from the cabin. People reached for bags, gathered coats, reset smiles. But this wasn't a typical arrival. Not anymore. Because this time, they weren't just walking into Seattle. They were carrying something out of the cabin that didn't fit in any overhead bin. And Ethan, he stayed seated, last to stand, not out of stubbornness, but because this time, staying seated had meant something. The cabin door opened with a hiss. A blast of cool, filtered jetway air swept into the front of the plane as the bridge connected. Passengers began to rise, laptops tucked away, shoes slipped back on, neck pillows removed. But Ethan Royce stayed seated, not because he needed more time, because this time he wanted to exit Laston his own terms. Marla stepped over, her voice gentle. Would you like me to escort you off the aircraft? Mr. Royce Ethan looked up. Thank you. But no, I'm fine walking. She nodded. There was something more than professionalism in her eyes and respect. Then she said something unexpected. My dad used to say, integrity shows most when no one's watching. She smiled faintly. But today, everyone watched. And you still had it. Ethan offered a soft smile. He sounds like a good man. Marla nodded, eyes glistening. He was. The other passengers filed out. Some gave him polite nods. Some paused to say thank you. Others, like Harold and 2B, offered a firm handshake before stepping away. No speeches, no long apologies, just presence. That was enough. As Ethan rose and stepped into the jet bridge, he felt it in his body. Not pride, not victory, but something deeper, a quiet sense of completion, like he'd carried something heavy through the sky, and finally put it down. The terminal was humming with morning traffic. Screens blinking, suitcases rolling, airport agents directing families and flyers like clockwork. But near gate C-24, just beyond the boarding counter, stood a woman in a sharp black blazer, phone in hand, eyes scanning the incoming passengers. She spotted Ethan, straightened, and approached. Mr. Royce. He paused. Yes. She extended her hand. Claire Dunley, Director of Employee Culture at Pacific Air. I came to meet you in person. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Langston send you. Claire gave a small, knowing smile. He didn't have to. Word moves quickly when the CEO quietly rewrites company policy mid-air. Ethan shook her hand. Her grip was confident, sincere. Claire continued, We're already preparing the empathy training framework. Your notes were blunt, but necessary. He nodded. That's what happens when the truth sits in economy. She laughed lightly, surprised by his dry humor, then turned serious. We've had complaints about Olivia before. Nothing dramatic, just patterns, subtle ones, enough to make people uncomfortable, but not enough to escalate. Until today, Ethan said quietly. Claire nodded. Until today. She hesitated before speaking again. I just want you to know this isn't going to get buried. We're not just covering our tracks. You've given us a chance to rebuild how we train our people, to see passengers. Ethan looked around the terminal at the business travelers, the parents, the students, the quiet ones carrying heavy stories. See them? He repeated. Truly, Claire said, then added, You didn't need to speak up, but you did, not with anger, with clarity. He exhaled. I don't want this to be about me. I want it to be about the next passenger who gets profiled, so they don't have to document the moment to be believed. Claire looked at him for a long second, then said, We'll make sure of that. She handed him a sealed envelope. This is unofficial, but this came from the flight crew manager. Marla requested it be passed to you. Ethan opened it after she walked away. Inside was a small folded note, written in a looping, careful hand. Thank you for showing me what calm leadership looks like. I'll carry this moment into every cabin I ever serve again. Marla, he closed the note, slipped it into his jacket, and walked toward baggage claim in silence. Outside the airport, his driver was waiting, door already open. Seattle air smelled like damp pine and new rain. As he slid into the back seat, Ethan opened his phone again. A new message from Camille's social media caught the moment. Unconfirmed tweets only, but trending. Do you want us to respond now, or stay silent? He stared at the screen, and then typed back, Let it speak for itself. Sometimes silence is the loudest kind of leadership. He closed the phone and finally let himself rest. The hotel suite overlooked the Seattle harbor. Ethan Royce stood barefoot near the window, tie loosened, jacket draped across the back of a chair. The city lights blinked below like patient stars. In one hand, he held a tumbler of ginger tea, not bourbon, not wine. He needed to be present tonight, fully awake for the quiet. His phone rested face down on the coffee table beside a folded boarding pass and a small linen envelope with Marla's note still tucked inside. Somehow, he couldn't throw it away, not because of the words, but because of the reminder that someone had been watching when it mattered, and someone had learned. He'd spent the evening in 3 back-to-back calls with the Pacific Air Board. Every conversation came with layers corporate apologies, legal language, operational reviews. They all wanted to know one thing. What message do we send publicly? And Ethan had told them the truth. This can't be about damage control. It has to be about culture. If your apology is louder than your correction, you've already failed. Now, in the quiet of the room, Ethan returned to his notebook, the same one he'd carried through hundreds of flights, where he'd tracked tech ideas, people patterns, moments of stillness. Tonight, he opened to a fresh page and wrote a new heading in clean, all capital letters. The cost of being calm. Then, underneath, people don't see what it takes to stay composed when you're being erased in real time. They only see the dignity, not the tension in your jaw, not the memory of every insult you swallowed before this one, not the way your body prepares for disbelief. He exhaled, then underlined the word belief. The knock at the door startled him gently. It was room service. A young woman brought in a tray of late dinner, just roasted vegetables, rice, and chamomile. Before she left, she paused by the door. Sir, I just wanted to say. She looked nervous, then offered a polite smile. My brother texted me about what happened on your flight. Said you changed how people see power. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Did I? She nodded. He said he didn't know you could lead without yelling. Ethan gave a quiet laugh. Neither did I. Once. The woman smiled, bowed her head, and left. He stood by the window again, plate untouched. Across the water, planes blinked in slow rhythm as they descended. How many of them carried someone quietly carrying something? A grief, a decision, a version of themselves they had to leave in the seat pocket. He thought of Olivia, not with bitterness, but with realism. He wondered if she'd reflect, if she'd remember his face not because she got disciplined, but because she finally saw it. And if not, that too would be part of the work. Not every seed grows in front of you. His phone buzzed softly. A final message from Camille. Pacific Air Board unanimously approved the Royce protocol. First training module goes live next month. Name stays, unless you object. He stared at the screen. Part of him wanted to rename it, to hide, to step aside. But then he remembered. This wasn't about ego. It was about a door. A door he didn't kick open. He just refused to let it close again. He replied, "Let it stay. If it helps one more person sit in peace without being questioned, then it's worth my name." He put the phone down. The lights of the harbor blurred slightly as his eyes finally let go. And with a long breath, his first full breath of the day, Ethan sat down, closed the notebook, and whispered into the silence, "Let them learn from my stillness." And maybe they would. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He didn't even raise his voice. But his presence spoke louder than anything on that plane. This story isn't just about a man denied a seat. It's about the quiet cost of composure, the kind of grace people of color are forced to carry to be seen as professional, the kind of stillness that's often mistaken for weakness. Ethan Royce didn't fire the flight attendant out of anger. He asked for empathy training because he knew the problem wasn't just one person. It was the system that taught her to act that way. This isn't just about what happened at Seat 2A. It's about all the seats that have been quietly taken, questioned, or denied, and all the people who never had a platform to say this isn't okay. So if this story moved you, if it made you feel, reflect, or even pause for just a moment, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Because the more we tell these stories, the more we challenge silence. We'll see you next time, right where it matters most, in the seat where truth sits quietly and finally gets heard.